to the cloud so that it can be posted on the Field Library's YouTube page. So that's all I have. Dan, it is now yours. I'm going to mute myself.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's event. I'm thrilled to say we have a great turnout, and I thank you all for joining us. My name is Dan Grossman. As Jack said, I'm the Secretary of the Friends of the Field Library. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to briefly go over the format for tonight. And then following the introduction, Josh will speak about his work and the various subjects connected to the focus of tonight's event. Following Josh's remarks, we'll have a question and answer session. If you think of any questions during the program, feel free to post them in the chat room, as Jack said, but I just ask that you wait until Josh concludes his remarks before putting them in so I can track them more easily. And now that we're done with the formalities of tonight, please allow me to introduce our guest. Josh Mensch is an author, journalist, documentary television showrunner, producer, and director. He has co-authored 2 New York Times best-selling nonfiction history books, The First Conspiracy, The Secret Plot to Kill George Washington, and The Lincoln Conspiracy, The Secret Plot to Kill America's 16th President and Why It Failed, both published by Flatiron Books. The subject of the latter work is President-elect Lincoln's inaugural train ride from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. in 1861, and the Baltimore-centered attempt to thwart the soon-to-be 16th president from actually becoming the 16th president. On a local note, it was this very train ride that saw Mr. Lincoln stop briefly in Peekskill on February 19th, 1861, his only stop in Westchester County, New York State. As a documentary writer and filmmaker, Josh's work has appeared on the History Channel, National Geographic, PBS, Discovery, and elsewhere. His work covers a wide variety of subjects in American history, including the Hatfields and McCoys, World War II, jazz, superheroes, and Bob Dylan. He has conducted interviews with well-known politicians, historians, entertainers, directors, and others. Josh is a graduate of Princeton University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. We are honored to have him here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Josh Mensch to Peekskill and all the other areas this event is reaching. Josh, welcome and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Appreciate that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in here and showing some interest in this book. I thought to start with, I'll just say a few words about the work. We found that for these virtual events, the more lively part is usually the Q&A, and when people get a chance to ask some questions. So I'll keep my own remarks on the shorter side and then let Daniel come in and start asking some questions and let others ask questions. But to talk about this book, I thought it would be interesting to start with an area that has some kind of unexpected resonance to today. And of course, when we set out to write the book, we couldn't predict the future, and we didn't know some things that would be happening in our country today. But as often happens with these projects, you start working on something, and then you start to see parallels and similarities to what's going on out there in society and in politics. And so I really wanted to sort of frame this by talking about the transition period after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 to his inauguration, because of course we also just went through quite a contentious transition period in this country. And there are some interesting parallels and similarities. Of course, there are many, many differences, but a lot of what we covered for our book and the events in the book, I think will ring a bell with today. And I know it felt like this election we just had was extremely contentious, controversial, with a lot of anger on both sides. But as contentious as it was, I don't think anything will ever compare to the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was first elected president. That election was just in a class by itself. And it was a very complicated election. Entire books have been written just about that election, and many more will be written, and they should be, because there's so much to unpack. But to try to kind of summarize it, the country was incredibly divided during this election, and it was divided almost entirely on the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery completely dominated the country, the discourse, the debate, politics. It was a great moral issue that struck at the very heart of the country and what the country was and what it was supposed to be, and the country's economy. And people were extremely passionate about this issue. The South, of course, were the slave owning states, and the North were mostly free states. There were some states in the middle that went in either direction. Some of the middle states were slave states and some were free states, the so-called border states. But the country was just incredibly divided on this issue. And during the election, it was a complicated election because there were actually 4 candidates. The Southern kind of pro-slavery vote was split between 2 candidates, but Abraham Lincoln was the Northern candidate and the closest thing to an anti-slavery candidate. And so it felt to everyone in the country like the entire future of this institution of slavery that was so incredibly divisive and so morally disruptive was on the line on this election. And the stakes just could not be any higher. And it felt to so many people like the very future of the country was going to hinge on whoever won this election. And because the South divided their vote, Abraham Lincoln, who really was the anti-slavery Northern candidate from Illinois, was able to win a plurality of the votes in the country. And it was a narrow but decisive enough election. And so on November 6, 1860, he is elected president. But there's this long period before his inauguration. It's even longer than it was today. At that time, Inauguration Day wasn't until early March. So you have this long stretch from early November to early March where there really is no president. The outgoing president, especially this particular president at the time, President Buchanan, was a very weak president. He was exhausted. He was tired. He was ineffectual. He had essentially given up. And so there was no leadership. And all eyes were on Abraham Lincoln, who very few people knew anything about. He was a surprise nominee for the Republican Party at the time, which at the time was a very, very different party than the Republican Party of today. It was really the Northern Party. The Democratic Party was the Southern Party, kind of the opposite of what we have now. Also, there were just so many differences that you can't really compare the parties now and then. But he was not well known at all. Most people didn't know anything about him. And yet, at this incredibly contentious moment when the country is so divided, he is going to be the new president. So all eyes in the country turn towards the city of Springfield, Illinois, not, kind of considered a backwater at the time, where this relatively unknown man has just assumed the presidency. And he was a very odd candidate. He was an odd person to be president. He was from the West. There weren't many presidents from the West at that time. He, of course, famously grew up very poor in the frontier. He was not considered cultured or educated enough for the job. He wasn't well dressed. He was 6'4" and skinny as a rail. He was a very awkward looking man. His clothes never fit him properly. Other people had to dress him because he had no fashion sense whatsoever. He was constantly the butt of jokes for how sort of physically unattractive he was. At the time, the word was homely that everyone used. So everyone just made fun of him for being homely. Every journalist who wrote about him, the first thing they wrote about was his appearance. And no one knew what to think of this guy. He had some famous debates and had given a couple of speeches that had caught some attention because he was extremely eloquent and his words were often extremely captivating and didn't seem to match the sort of very unimpressive physical appearance of the man. But his words were beautiful, and at least for those who were on the more anti-slavery side, he spoke with this incredible moral eloquence that really captivated people. Although at the time he was elected, his position on slavery was really a very modest anti-slavery position. He was not a full abolitionist. He was someone who was charting sort of a careful anti-slavery position that wouldn't offend too many people. And we can get into that a little bit more later. But he was really kind of a centrist, but an anti-slavery centrist. But for the South, he was an incredible threat because he was a president who was saying that slavery was morally wrong. Even if he was not intending to abolish slavery in the South, he was opposed to the spread of slavery, and he believed that slavery was wrong. He just didn't believe that he or any president had the legal authority to force states to prohibit it. but he was opposed to it morally, and he was very much against it being able to spread in any of the new territories that were then joining the country. And so from the point of view of the South, he was an incredible threat to the Southern economy and to the entire Southern way of life, which had been built from the very beginning on the institution of slavery. So he was an existential threat to half of the country. And to the other half of the country, he was relatively unknown and people didn't quite know what to think of him. So this election occurs just against this backdrop of incredible division in the country. And the nature of his election is such that, you know, he's this very unknown guy. He's relatively inexperienced in national politics. He's about to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And a few of the things that happened to him from the moment he is elected is by the next day, as they're starting to gather the mail, the first thing that they discover are just a litany of death threats against this new president, Abraham Lincoln. There are so many of them. They just come pouring in on the mail that one of the first jobs of his brand new secretary, really the first staff member that he hires as president-elect, is to sort through all the death threats and try to see if any of them are legitimate. And of course, a few previous presidents had received some threats of violence, but there had never been anything like this. And the reason he received so many death threats is because he was anti-slavery. And in the South, that was reason to be violent. And a lot of people simply refused to accept that this man could be the president. And so there were all these threats to kill him and warnings from friends that his life was in danger. Rumors are circulating about violence in the country. And all of this was very foreign to him as a person because it was just not in his nature to be paranoid or to think that people are out to get him. He was not a violent person himself, and just sort of by his nature, he always wanted to believe in the best in people. He always wanted to believe in the best of Americans, and he just couldn't believe or take seriously that people wanted to kill him. And he would joke to his friends, I haven't done anything yet. Let me be president, and then I can do some things, and then you can hate me and want to kill me, but give me a chance to be president before you decide you want to kill me. And so he would kind of joke about it and make light of it, and he didn't really take these threats seriously, although his friends and associates did take them very seriously. And then, so the first thing he receives are a lot of death threats. And then within 3 days of his election, the state of South Carolina passes a resolution. It's a non-binding resolution, so it's not the law of the state yet, but it's a resolution essentially announcing from the state legislature that they plan to secede from the country because Abraham Lincoln is going to be president and because he is threatening the institution of slavery, and the state of South Carolina refuses to abide by that, and they are essentially announcing their plan to secede. So that's within a couple days of his election. So the guy hasn't even gotten a chance to kind of, get used to the idea that he'll be president before everything is falling apart around him. And so this period between his election and his inauguration, that really sets the stage for it. And during this period, a writer at the time gave it the term the Great Secession Winter, because it is this period of time when he is President-elect Lincoln, and the country really has no president, when the country essentially falls apart. And one by one, Southern states start voting to secede from the Union. South Carolina is first, but soon others follow suit. There are several Carolina finally formally announces its secession or votes upon its secession on December 20th. And then in early January, several other states follow suit. So the country is quite literally falling apart. The Union, as it was known, was threatened. And it's during this period when there's no president. And so that's the environment that he's kind of walking into. And one of the parallels to today is that Washington, D.C., rumors immediately start circulating about threats to storm the city and to storm, in particular, to storm the Capitol building, because so many in the country are just refusing to accept the results of the election. Now, it wasn't sort of the mechanics of the election that were being questioned. No one was saying that there were fraudulent vote counts. It was more that that some states and the public in some states was just refusing to accept the very idea of Abraham Lincoln as the new president, or the very idea that there could be a threat to the institution of slavery. And so the recourse to that is to basically threaten to prevent the election from being certified, to prevent the inauguration from happening. And so the city basically goes under lockdown. There's this wonderful essay that we quote in the book called The Great Secession Winner by a journalist at the time named Henry Adams, who was the one who coined that term that others later picked up on. But he wrote this essay called The Great Secession Winner, in which he talks about all of the threats to the Capitol. And there were, rumors of various militias, storming the Capitol, taking over the Capitol building. There were threats on the lives of senators and other elected officials, as well as this sort of general threat against the incoming president. There was a notion that there would be groups who would storm the city and just physically prevent the inauguration from taking place, because they just refused to abide by the results of the election. So it was very much the Capitol building specifically that was being threatened at this time. And all this extra security was needed in the capital city in order to try to prevent any of these potential threats. And of course, it was very confusing because it was hard to know which of these threats were real and which of these rumors were real, but some of them were very credible. And meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln, who's sitting there in Springfield, Illinois, has to figure out logistically how to get to Washington, D.C. in this heightened, tense environment when the country is sort of falling apart. And he knows that half the country already hates him and basically wants him dead. And the capital city is under threat. And he's about to assume the most powerful position in the land. And no one really knows who he is or knows much about him. And so he devises this, he and his supporters devise this train journey for him to get from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. And this was an incredibly complicated undertaking. Rail travel then was not like our modern rail travel or plane travel. It took a long time to get somewhere, and you had to switch trains and switch train lines constantly. And the logistics of planning this were just going to be momentous. And because of the political situation, there was just all this heightened attention on every move he was going to make. And he knew that in every single town that they would be passing through, there would be big crowds to see him. Of course, at the time, there was no mass media. You couldn't turn on the TV and see your new president give a speech or your president-elect give a speech. This was the only way people could actually see what a president looked like. There were some early photographs and drawings, but this was the only chance to actually see a president give a speech, would be to actually, go to the train station where his train was passing through, or, go to the whatever the reception hall would be where he's giving a speech. And because of what was happening in the country, this was just such a loaded time, and everyone wanted to hear what he was going to say. So he had to plan this trip. And in addition to just giving a chance for people to see him, it was a chance for, of course, his supporters, his political supporters in all the towns and cities between Springfield, Illinois and Washington, D.C., to talk to him, to meet with him. He could meet governors, he could meet state senators and state legislators, he could meet mayors, and all of the people that helped him get elected and the people whose support he's really going to need for his new presidency. So he plans this very elaborate 2-week-long train journey from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. to take place in February. And it takes months and months to plan. And this entire entourage is going to go with him. And the first thing they have to think about is security, because of all these death threats and this idea that he's going to be mobbed and people are going to try to assassinate him. There are rumors that he's going to be poisoned at the hotels where he's staying. It's just crazy. And he has to figure out what his security is going to be. He refuses to have a military entourage because, of course, that's not the signal he wants to send to a country where there's now quite a very real threat of the country splitting apart, rumors of, civil war and whatnot. He's trying to bring the country together. So he doesn't want to travel with soldiers, which would just give the exact wrong impression that he wants to give. He wants to be a uniter. He wants to try to mend the country. So he refuses to travel with a battalion of armed soldiers. So he just has this kind of ragtag group of bodyguards who aren't really trained. It's like his old buddies, his like 300-pound drinking buddy from the Illinois legal law circuit who he used to travel with. It's a ragtag bunch, a couple of retired soldiers who are well past their prime, but they're loyal. They all pack some pistols and hunting knives and brass knuckles, and they promise to keep him safe. But it's a dubious situation given what he's about to walk into. So that's this trip that they're planning, and it's a very circuitous route that takes him through all the northern states. He wanted to go south, but it was just deemed too dangerous. They were afraid that, if his train goes into Kentucky or goes into, one of the other southern states or Virginia, that something could happen and the train gets stuck there and they would be surrounded by, a very hostile population. It was just too dangerous. So it's a northern route. And he goes through, starts in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, back into Pennsylvania again. He kind of crisscrosses back and forth over some state lines, hits all the big cities on the way. But the problem is, to get to Washington, D.C., no matter what, he's going to have to go through at least one slave state. And the choices are Virginia, which is a very long trip to get through Virginia, given the trains at the time. So that really was not an option. The only other option was the state of Maryland. And that's just it's actually north of Washington, D.C., of course. And so to get there, he can come from the north and go through Maryland to get to Washington, D.C. And there's just no choice. They have to do it. But this is very much a public journey, and the entire itinerary is going to be published. So everyone in Maryland knows that the incoming President-elect Abraham Lincoln, anti-slavery president, is coming through the pro-slavery state of Maryland to get to Washington, D.C. And that's where, the story we tell highlights, the real danger is, because this is hostile territory. And particularly the city of Baltimore is a real kind of key city to the South at the time. And there's a very strong pro-slavery sentiment in the city of Baltimore. A lot of powerful kind of moneyed slave interests are there, powerful business people who profit from the slave trade out of the port of Baltimore. No one in Baltimore voted for Abraham Lincoln. We put the numbers in the book, but it's like 1.2% of the people in the city, the county that includes Baltimore, voted for him. I could be wrong on that exact number, but it's very, very few. There are some counties elsewhere in Maryland where he got 0 votes. So this was, I think the state total might have been 4%, somewhere in that territory. So this really is hostile territory, and the city of Baltimore is a dangerous place. It's a complicated city. It's a city that has also just kind of a history of gang violence and agitation. It's a very volatile city, and there's sort of a mix of rich and poor. So you have a lot of rich people who can support some of these militias that are kind of organizing, Southern militias that are organizing at the time. And you have a kind of a very sort of volatile and populace that's, again, sort of prone to gang violence and political violence. So it's a combustible city. And the way railroads worked at the time, you couldn't just drive a train through a city. In most big cities, you had to get out of one train on one side of the city, cross through the city, and then go to a different train station to get a different train that takes you, continues on the journey. And in the case of Baltimore and Abraham Lincoln's journey, he's going to have to take a train down from Philadelphia, get to one side of Baltimore, cross through the city, through the public streets, and then catch another train on the other side of Baltimore to catch his train down to DC. And the only way to get from one station to the other is just to, cross through the city. And every city they're encountering, there are these massive throngs of people just crowding the streets to see the new president-elect. Every city he's been in has been just an absolute mob scene. And so that's what they're expecting and anticipating in this hostile city of Baltimore. Now, at the time that Lincoln and his team is preparing for this journey, and at the time that the city of Washington, D.C., is full of rumors of Southern militias who are going to come in and storm the Capitol and prevent the inauguration from taking place, or prevent the electors from being certified, to prevent Congress from certifying the electors. That sounds familiar because it was January 6th of this year, that we had violence in the Capitol. And that's exactly what they were concerned with in early 1861, that the Capitol would be stormed to prevent the certification of the electors. So Washington, D.C. is dealing with threats of violence. The city of Baltimore is in an uproar. Abraham Lincoln is planning his journey. And it just so happens at this time that a railroad president named Samuel Felton, who runs the rail line from Philadelphia through Wilmington in Delaware, and that ends in Baltimore, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, begins to hear rumors that his train tracks could be sabotaged. And specifically, he hears rumors that the tracks could be sabotaged by Southern sympathizers and Southern activists and militias who are trying to prevent the inauguration. So it's a way to prevent Abraham Lincoln from getting to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated. So this railroad president hears that his tracks are in danger. And of course, he doesn't want his railroad tracks to be sabotaged. So he starts investigating the situation and investigating these rumors. And he starts poking around, and he finds that these rumors are really very credible. But he also finds that no one is going to help him. He talks to the chief of police in Baltimore, and the chief of police doesn't want to do anything about it. He says, basically, sorry, I'm not going to help you. And later it's revealed that the chief of police in Baltimore was basically on the side of the Southern secessionists who were trying to disrupt things. So he hears all these rumors, and he doesn't know where to turn to investigate them and try to prevent them. And the only person he can think of is this very interesting character from Chicago named Alan Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton is a very colorful character in 19th century America. He is really credited as America's first ever private detective. He has a very colorful story. I won't get into all the details. Originally from Scotland, he was an immigrant from a very poor background. He was kind of a stocky working class guy. He was a cooper, who is someone who makes barrels. And you can imagine the kind of person it is who, melds the iron that you need to create barrels. Really tough Scottish working class guy who had settled in a small town in Illinois, and just through kind of a series of chance circumstances ends up getting involved in law enforcement and moves to Chicago. And he's really the first person to have this idea, let's create a detective firm, but that's entirely private, so that anyone, a business or an individual, could hire this firm to do detective work and to do law enforcement that the state officials aren't willing to do. So he had created this very innovative new idea of a private detective, and he would was responsible for many great innovations in law enforcement that the FBI and other organizations would draw a lot from later. So he was a real pioneer, and Samuel Felton, the railroad president, knew about this guy. They had worked together in the past and said, I'm going to hire Alan Pinkerton, America's first private detective, to investigate this situation. This is serious business. I need the best person. So he hires Alan Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton, they go through some back and forth, which we detail in the book, but he takes the job. And within a few days, he and his team of agents are on their way to Baltimore, and they specialize in undercover work. So this team from Chicago is ready to go undercover as Southerners and Southern sympathizers and try to get involved in some of these underground organizations in Baltimore that are full of these pro-slavery, white supremacist activist groups. And he's basically going undercover with some of the most frightening organizations in the country. And he and his team, they adopt fake names and they pretend they're from Alabama. And Pinkerton himself pretends he's a businessman from the South, a stockbroker. And they each adopt different personas. And their plan is just to basically infiltrate Southern society in Baltimore and figure out where the action is and learn what's going on. And what happens is, so they go there with a mandate to discover who's threatening railroad tracks in Maryland. His client is Samuel Felton, the head of this railroad. And so that's who he's answering to. But what he discovers when he gets to Baltimore is that the talk of the city, in all these kind of underground pro-Southern groups, social clubs and whatnot, at the bars where people are, drinking and talking and gossiping, the talk of the city is not about railroad tracks. The talk of the city is about an attempt to potentially assassinate Abraham Lincoln on his way to Washington, D.C. as part of this inaugural journey that he's doing. And he quickly becomes very, very concerned about this plot. And he goes to Samuel Felton, who had hired him, this railroad president, and says, look, I'm investigating your railroad. Don't worry about that. But I'm also learning something that's kind of more important, which is that there is a serious plan afoot to assassinate the incoming president. And I feel an obligation to investigate this. And will you support me investigating this? And the railroad president, who, in addition to caring about his railroad, he's a Northerner. He's a union guy. He is very much wants to protect the union, and he's a Lincoln supporter. He says, absolutely, do what you need to do, investigate this as much as you need, and I will help in any way I possibly can. And of course, his railroad is kind of a key piece of the inaugural journey. So he's on board. And so Alan Pinkerton and his team go undercover and they just investigate this plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And they quickly learn the details that, sure enough, when Lincoln has to switch trains in Baltimore in the middle of the day, a couple days before the day before his arrival in Washington, D.C., there's this period when he's going to be crossing through the city in broad daylight, probably by carriage. And the conspirators come up with a plan that they are going to attack. That's their moment to attack. And they come up with this quite elaborate scheme where they're going to create a disturbance so that the police, who are supposed to be the kind of security detail to receive the president as he's crossing through the city, the president-elect, they're going to create a disturbance. Meanwhile, there's throngs of people everywhere. So they're going to create a disturbance near the train station where Abraham Lincoln arrives, distract the police. And while the police are distracted, they will swarm his carriage right outside the train station. And, they'll have their weapons ready and they're going to attack and try to assassinate him right there in the city. So Alan Pinkerton then learns of this plot. And of course, some of the details are more clear than others. Some of it's based on rumor. Some of it's based on, conflicting accounts of what they're going to do or who's involved. But he's confident enough in this plan that he feels like they absolutely have to do something to stop it. And that means getting in touch with the president somehow, getting in touch with the president-elect somehow. And how do you do that in the age of before the internet, before the phone, before text messaging? How do you contact the president and his entourage that's at that time crossing through the country, going city to city? Meanwhile, Pinkerton and his team is in Baltimore unearthing this plot. And somehow they have to figure out what to do and how to notify the president-elect's entourage, Lincoln's entourage, that this is happening, and then figure out some way to prevent it. So in our book, we cover the complicated details of that and how they have to, using telegraphs, somehow communicate with the Lincoln entourage that is incredibly busy at the time, going from town to town to town, and let them know of this pending assassination plot. Now, as the days go on, Lincoln is getting closer and closer to Washington, D.C. He's at this point, by the end of his journey, which started on, sorry, I'm suddenly blanking on the date. Let me just grab that. Started on Monday, February 11th, is when the train departed, and it's a roughly 2-week journey. So, 10 days into the journey, he's rounding the corner from Albany and starting to head down towards New York City and getting closer and closer to Washington, D.C. And of course, that's when he passes from Albany to Washington, D.C. through, along the Hudson River, and on February 19th, he begins his day in Albany at 7:45 in the morning, passes through Troy, passes through Hudson, passes through Rhinebeck, right there close to the Hudson River, gets to Poughkeepsie, then to Fishkill, and sometime in the mid-afternoon, he makes a stop in, he and his entourage, the train makes a stop in Peekskill, and he's able to give a nice little speech there. As he's been doing along this journey, he's been giving speeches at every town he stops in. Sometimes he'll just sort of stop at the train station and give a little speech from the back of the train. In bigger cities, he gets out and there are parades and receptions, and he goes staying at hotels and goes to luncheons and dinners and what have you. It's an incredibly packed schedule. But he does make a stop in Peekskill, and in fact, it's his last stop before New York City. And of course, New York City is going to be a major stop on this journey when the entire city is out to greet him. But Peekskill is his last stop before New York City. So it's kind of an important stop in that regard. They're kind of preparing for this big final leg that will include the really major eastern cities, New York City and Philadelphia, and then down through Baltimore and Washington, and then to Washington D.C. So he's really getting to the center of the storm here, and he's really in a bind during this trip in terms of what he can say, because he really believes that as the president-elect, he shouldn't say too much. He should wait until he's president and then start announcing all of his policies and saying what he's going to do. But the country's falling apart. States are seceding literally during this journey or just before and after it. And everyone wants to know what he's going to do and what he's going to say. So he has to be very careful. But he really wants to strike a note of unity as much as he possibly can. He's trying to prevent the country from falling apart. He knows he's very divisive, and that his stance, his anti-slavery position, has not endeared him to the South, and that he has a very tough road ahead of him. But he's doing everything he possibly can and saying everything he can to try to unify the country. So he's very humble on these stops. He talks about trying to bring the country together, and he tries not to say anything divisive. At the same time, he does have to stand by his principles, and he knows his supporters elected him to be an anti-slavery president. And so he can't just ignore the issue. And so he does speak about the importance of liberty, and why he is opposed to slavery, but he has to be very careful about what he says on this journey. And of course, everything he says gets criticized from both sides. He gets attacked by every newspaper in the country, for just saying hello, because it's just such a contentious time, and there's nothing he can say that will make everyone happy. But Peekskill is an example of one of these towns where he stops and tries to say a few unifying words and a few humble words before he gets to New York City. Anyway, it's in New York City that one of Alan Pinkerton's agents, a woman named Kate Warren, who's a fascinating character in her own right, and we write about her quite a bit in the book. She's America's first woman detective of any kind, not just private detective, but first woman detective. And so she was a real pioneer, as was Alan Pinkerton. And he took, by hiring her on his team, he was being very unconventional. It was not considered work that a woman could or should do at that time. It was dangerous work. So he was really bucking convention. But she turned out to be an incredibly accomplished agent and detective. Pinkerton thought the world of her, and that's partly why he sends her on this incredibly important task to go to New York City, where throngs of 300,000 people are crowding every street in the tiny island of Manhattan, and she has to somehow get to the hotel where Lincoln and his entourage are going to be staying, talk her way into the hotel, and then make contact with someone from Lincoln's entourage and convince that person that there's a serious plot afoot. They had already reached out to one person on the entourage by telegram, but this was really the first chance to make contact. And so Kate Warren comes up there to New York City and is able to do her job and make contact with someone on Lincoln's entourage. Again, we detail all of it on the book, and basically says there's a serious plot afoot and you need to talk to Alan Pinkerton. And so when you get to Philadelphia in a couple of days, we need to set up a meeting with Alan Pinkerton directly, and he's going to lay out all the details and all the evidence, and we're going to figure out what we're going to do about this. And so she lays the groundwork, and then Lincoln's train continues on from New York City. He spends a full extra day there. And then it's when he gets to Philadelphia that the night he stays, first night he stays in Philadelphia, it's one of the busiest days on his itinerary. The city of Philadelphia is just an absolute mob scene. And the streets are thronged all day and night. And that's where, after a kind of a 14-hour day of giving speeches and shaking hands, he's exhausted. Lincoln is exhausted. His voice is hoarse. He had just gotten over this terrible cold that he had gotten because he had been standing outside in the freezing cold giving speeches for 2 weeks. He's just a wreck. And it's after midnight on this night in Philadelphia that he personally is finally told that he's got to take this really important meeting with this private detective, Alan Pinkerton, who he knows of. And that's where he sits down, and Abraham Lincoln is told for the first time that there's a plot to assassinate him on his way to Washington, D.C. in a couple days when he passes through Baltimore. And they're going to have to figure out how he can avoid this assassination plot, which is in an advanced stage. The details of exactly how they get around the plot are detailed in the book, and I can talk about some of them in the Q&A, but I thought I wanted to really set up this environment of the country at this time that's totally divided on the issue of slavery, the great issue of in American history, the great moral issue. 4 million people are in bondage, men, women, and children every single day. The country is being absolutely torn apart by it. Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery president, is elected. The Washington D.C. is under threat of assault by armed militias who are threatening to take over and storm the Capitol building. There are assassination plots. Several states have already seceded, and more are on the way. And that's the environment Abraham Lincoln is walking into as the incoming president. And they're going to have to avoid a pretty complicated assassination plot before he even gets to Washington, D.C. So that's what our book is about. And I'm happy to cover any details when we get into the Q&A. So I'll let others ask some questions. So Daniel, feel free.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was fantastic. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat room, and we can go through them. In the meantime, I actually had about 10 questions, but Josh has already covered about 8 of them. So we're good. But I do have a couple that I want to bring up. The first thing I want to ask about is, I thought a couple of very interesting things in the opening of the book that sort of set the tone for it. These were events that happened before the primary events of the book. And those 2 scenes were when a young Abe Lincoln was informed of the death of his sister. And then fast forward several decades, the 1856 beating of Charles Sumner, which was an ominous event. These things I thought really foreshadowed everything, both Lincoln's psychology and the country's psychology. I thought it was very interesting to have those 2 scenes up front before the events of the book as just sort of symbolic. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll start with the Sumner Brooks caning, as it's called, which, as you said, is kind of the ultimate foreshadowing in 1856 of everything to come. It's a sort of infamous event in American history, this incredible act of violence on the Senate floor. And it's really all about slavery. The Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who was really an abolitionist senator. There weren't too many elected senators who you would call full-on abolitionists, dyed-in-the-wool abolitionists, because being an abolitionist was still a radical position at that time. There was a kind of moderate anti-slavery position that I talked about with Abraham Lincoln, which is sort of being opposed to slavery, but you still allow it to occur in the South as long as it doesn't spread, and maybe eventually we'll get rid of it. That was kind of the moderate position. Charles Sumner was a real abolitionist. He believed that slavery was an abomination. It was a sin. It contradicted all the great American ideals. And in the very anti-slavery state of Massachusetts, a senator who was an abolitionist could actually be elected. So Charles Sumner is one of the great abolitionist senators in American history. And he gives this really long speech that's a classic anti-slavery speech. That's a 3-day long speech on the floor of the Senate. And in this speech, he insults personally a fellow congressperson from South Carolina who's aged. And this aged elected official has a nephew, a younger congressperson from South Carolina named Preston Brooks, who's 36 years old, who was not there to physically hear Sumner's speech, but heard about it and read about it and learned that that his own relative was kind of been insulted in this speech. But really, it was about slavery. This was an anti-slavery speech, and Preston Brooks from South Carolina was a pro-slavery elected official and was just insulted by this speech. And it was just this rift in the country. Charles Sumner, it was considered a somewhat incendiary speech by the South, by members of the South. And Brooks, a couple days after the speech, who feels like, in addition to it being an anti-slavery speech, was a speech that personally insulted his relative. Towards the end of a day, at the end of a work day, at the end of the workday in the U.S. Senate, Charles Sumner is sitting there at his desk finishing up his day. He was actually organizing copies of his big speech that he had given a few days earlier to be published and distributed around the country. He's sitting there and he doesn't even notice when this 36-year-old congressperson from South Carolina walks in, flanked by two of his friends, his buddies who are also Southern members of Congress. And Preston Brooks walks, he's carrying a cane. He's got a slight limp due to an injury. He walks up to Charles Sumner's desk and basically says, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but says, "You have insulted, my state and my family, and I'm going to make you pay." And he raises his cane and proceeds to beat Charles Sumner nearly to death right there on the Senate floor in front of several onlookers, several other senators and congresspeople and other people who had just been sort of filing around. And his buddies prevent people coming to help out. So this senator is on the floor bleeding profusely, and this congressperson is just beating the hell out of him with this cane, striking him again and again and again, and ends up beating him, unconscious and to really within an inch of his life. It was only when people were finally able to break through and stop him, and his cane smashes to pieces, that this terrible act of violence was able to stop. And of course, it becomes national news, and all the northern newspapers are just absolutely appalled by this terrible act of violence on the Senate floor. All the southern newspapers, or most of them, celebrate it. That's how strong the sentiment is in the country. They're saying, thank you, Congressman Brooks, for finally teaching these abolitionists a lesson. And I only wish you would do it to more of them. It was the country was so divided, and there was so much anger and rage on this issue that Brooks's act was celebrated. He became a folk hero throughout the South, and the pieces of his cane were sold as souvenirs. They were prized relics. If you could get a little piece of the cane that nearly killed a senator on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So this incident really sets the stage for the violence to come. It just suggests that the country was at an impasse, and not just elected officials, but the public everywhere was just in a state of near war on this issue of slavery. So that really set the tone for it. So that's why we chose to tell this story, even though it, doesn't have anything immediately to do with this assassination plot that comes later. It does in spirit have a lot to do with it, because the assassination plot was from, pro-Southern, pro-slavery sympathizers who, were very much the Preston Brookses of the country, who were organizing to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. I didn't even get into this crazy secret society that, the potential assassins belong to. We can talk about that later. But that's why we chose to open with it. Sorry, I'm giving a sort of long-winded description of this event. But you also mentioned Abraham Lincoln and the death of his sister. Everyone knows that Abraham Lincoln, grew up in the frontier in this log cabin. But it's only when you really learn about his life that you really understand the deprivation of his childhood and of his teenage years. He wasn't just, a country kid on the frontier. His family was dirt poor. And there were a lot of very, very poor, what we would call rural poverty right now, families making a go of it out there. And they just dealt with every possible privation you can imagine: starvation, disease, living in the cold and in the elements, just anything you can imagine. And his upbringing really was an upbringing of suffering. He watched his own mother die when he was 11 years old. She contracted this terrible sickness from cow's milk, that could quickly spread through a county if there were infected cows. And he watched her, in a period of 2 weeks, contract this disease and then suffer just these absolutely terrible, heartrending symptoms with no medical attention. He watched her die right in front of his eyes. He loved his mother. He had a very tough, kind of stern father. So he was absolutely traumatized by seeing his mother die at a young age. And the other closest person in his life was his older sister. They were separated by about a year and a half, I believe it is. They were very close. Not much is known about her, but he was very attached to her. And by all accounts, what few accounts there are, she was a very kind young woman, and they were very close, and they really bonded. We tell this anecdote in the book that after his mother's death, his father basically had to go searching for a new wife because, as a single father raising 2 kids in the frontier where he has to work all day, every day, you really can't do it. And the wife, both parents in these frontier households basically had to work morning, noon, and night in order to provide for their families. They had to make their own clothes, farm their own land, make their own food, and just deal with all kinds of difficult situations. And so a single parent couldn't really do it. So he basically had to go hunting for a wife, and he left his 11 or 12-year-old son and his 13 or 14-year-old sister alone for 6 weeks in this tiny cabin in the frontier to fend for themselves while he goes searching for a new wife. And they're basically starved by the time he comes back, and they don't even know whether he is coming back. They're totally on their own, no way to communicate with anyone. You can only imagine what it's like to go through something like that at that age. And he and his sister, were together through this, and they really bonded. And his father does come back with a stepmother who he becomes quite close to. But his sister really was the closest person in his life. And she ends up getting married in her teens, and gets pregnant quickly, and ends up, moving to a nearby town. And Abraham Lincoln learns as a teenager that his sister dies in childbirth. And he hears of it. She had been in labor. She was a late-term pregnancy. He learns of it really on the day of, when he's in his smokehouse cutting some wood or curing some meat, and a little group comes from the neighboring town to deliver the news to him. And we have these heartrending quotes in the book of people who saw him receive this news, and he just sits down and starts bawling. He puts his face in his hands, and everyone sees the tears. They describe his bony long fingers and the tears flowing through his fingers, because aside from his mother, who had also died, she was the only close person in his life. So he really had this incredible experience with with just repeated experience with the death of loved ones. And then, of course, his own children will be suffer terrible tragedies. He has the death of another child before he's elected president. So he by the time he goes on this inaugural journey, he has had a lot of experience with suffering and death. And as we say in the book, he has almost kind of a death wish. He feels like death is sort of following him around, and he has a premonition of his own death on his election night, which we describe. So that really just sets the tone for this story, both for him personally and for the politics. Sorry, that was again kind of a long answer, but
No, that was great. That was a great answer. We have some questions. What was your favorite letter or other primary source that you used, and how did it help your efforts to write this book?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. And it's going to be hard for me to, I think, come up with a favorite because there's so many, and I'd have to really think about it. If there's one particular letter. Of course, when you get into Abraham Lincoln, you're talking about really one of the great writers in American history. And his letters are often so thoughtful and beautiful, and the writing is so engaging and poetic, and often very funny. Of course, he was a great wit, and his writing is often very funny. His speaking is often funny too. So reading his speeches there's often a lot of humor. So wow, to pick a favorite, I mean, we quote some sort of famous letters in the book, like the letter he writes to, this really happens much later after the story we tell when he's the wartime president, but a letter he writes to a young girl when he learns that she's been orphaned and has just lost her father in the war. He writes this beautiful letter to her personally, basically identifying with her because, and I wish I had the letter in front of me, I would read it, but it's in the book and you can find it pretty easily, identifying with her. And he basically says, I know that the world is full of suffering. And for a child, this suffering is often worse because you don't understand it. And he says, and I know that because I know it from personal experience. He's referring, of course, to the death of his own mother, the death of his sister. So he's basically telling this young girl who's lost her father that I relate to you personally. I understand tragedy and I know what it's like to suffer. And it's just a short but poetic and beautiful letter that really shows his empathy, which of course is one of his great qualities as a president, as a leader. So that's one of my favorites. And then we also detail the wonderful letters back and forth between yet another young girl who wrote him, advising him to grow a beard. Was how he got the idea to grow a beard, and we tell the whole story in the book. It's so charming. And the letter that she writes to him is lovely and funny and wonderful, advising him to grow the beard. He says basically, my brothers, they're going to vote for these other guys, but and everyone says you're so homely. If you grow a beard, I think I can convince my older brothers, to vote for you. So why don't you grow a beard, and you won't be so homely anymore. And at first he just kind of brushes it off, and he writes her this very sweet note back. And he doesn't take her advice at first, but then when he's actually elected president, she wrote it before he was elected. He says, all right, maybe that's not such a bad idea. And he ends up taking her advice and grows the beard. Of course, it's now famous. And when he passes through her hometown on the way on this inaugural journey that I talked about, he notifies people in the town ahead and says, does anyone know this? His friends who live there, and says, does anyone know this girl? I want to meet her. And so when he makes, he stops there to give his speech, she's there waiting with a little bouquet of flowers. And he says, I really want to meet this girl, come forward, who advised me to grow this beard. And he goes and he leans down and tells her, thank you for the advice, and gives her a little kiss. And everyone loves it. And the newspapers write about it. So that's very wonderful too. Now there are much more serious primary sources we could talk about in terms of, the letters to and from Lincoln, just before and after his election, where he's really addressing the issue of slavery in a profound way and trying to navigate the politics of the day that are so complicated. So there are just so many wonderful letters that he wrote during this period. And then another, great cache of primary sources are just reading, especially some of the Southern newspapers at the time. You just can't believe that these were mainstream newspapers, and the vitriol and the racism. I mean, the term racism isn't even quite right, because we were talking about this era of slavery when just the default position in the South was that it was perfectly okay for one group of people to own another group of people. And it's not just defending their institution, but the rage and fury you see in all of these letters and essays written, basically just so angry that anyone should dare threaten this institution. So they're really quite powerful and disturbing to read. So I recommend, looking through them.
Great. I want to bring up the issues that actually happened after the events in the book that concern Lincoln's security after the events, going through the war and things like that. One of our listeners has written a comment I'm just going to read. He says that, "I know Lincoln did not like military escorts during his presidency. After his hat was shot off during a horse ride out to the old soldiers' home, he finally agreed to be guarded." And our listener says that half of those guards came from the city of Tarrytown, which is a few miles south of Peekskill. So we are honored. Thank you for pointing that out, Martin. But that led me to a question that I had. I know Lincoln was criticized in some parts for the surreptitious entry into Washington. Do you think that affected his views on having bodyguards and security later on during the war?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, as I said, he was not someone who liked security. He didn't like the very idea that as the president, he would have to kind of protect himself and that he should have armed guards. He had a very kind of idealistic view of the presidency. He's there to represent the people. He was elected democratically. The idea that his life would be in danger really went against every principle he believed in. He believed in the peaceful transition of power. And, for a while, his advisors would be angry at him because he wouldn't protect himself. He would just say, you know what, if they're gonna assassinate me, I just have to deal with it. Like that, I have to do my job as it was meant to be done, which is I'm a person who interacts with the people. I'm a person who represents the people. I can't be hiding from the people. And I need to be able to just openly do my business. And if someone's going to assassinate me, I will just have to accept it. That's better than kind of letting the office be overrun by paranoia and fear and security and military protection. Now, of course, we've gotten used to that. But at the time, it was new. It was somewhat new. And he just didn't want to go in that direction. But of course, once the war begins, he's a commander in chief. He can't allow himself to be endangered. And it's a war. There are armies fighting and killing. People are losing their lives every day. And he just had to start to think differently. And he had to start taking security more seriously, although he didn't protect himself in many cases as much as he should have, in hindsight, including, of course, going to the theater, really only a few weeks after, the surrender, Robert E. Lee's surrender, when the country is still in a very volatile state. So, whether this assassination plot led him to take things more seriously, it's hard to say, because he still didn't want to take them his life very seriously.
Martin, you have another question? If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, how you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is something dealing with Pinkerton. He must have been revered by Lincoln after they thwarted, the plot in Baltimore. And he went on through Pinkerton to provide a lot of the information and a lot of the hunting around for what the other Southern armies were up to and what, what would you call it? Surveillance, not surveillance, but military intelligence. Exactly. And I've read, and I don't know if it was in your book, but it basically, because the Union generals were constantly over predicting how much the other Southern generals had, they were so reluctant to attack, because they felt that they needed to have everything, they had to have superiority in this. Every knapsack had to be plugged down. More food meant more animals needed more food. And it was Pinkerton and his offices that were providing all this really terrible intelligence. when it got down to it, I always found that rather not interesting, but well, interesting, yes, but Pinkerton wasn't as quite a great thing as he might have thought himself to be.
Well, that's interesting. And this is an area where there's a lot of different research has been done, and a lot of people have very different opinions on this. And I can't claim to be an expert on this aspect of Pinkerton's career, but it is a fascinating question. As you said, he got, as soon as the war started, he basically volunteered. He and Lincoln got to know each other. I mean, he had, Pinkerton personally rode in this train with Lincoln to avoid the Baltimore plot. They were also both Chicagoans. They were both anti-slavery. They actually kind of had a lot in common. They both grew up in poverty or near poverty. So I think there was a real mutual respect between them. And as the war begins, Pinkerton, basically volunteers and says, I've got this incredible agency. We know how to spy. We know how to go undercover, sign us up. And sure enough, Lincoln sort of brings him into the war effort. And Pinkerton, in addition to becoming a pioneer in private intelligence agencies, running in sort of the world of being a private detective, he becomes a pioneer in military intelligence and conducts lots of surveillance against the South in the war. And it's, quite complicated what he does. And he has agents who are deep undercover in the South. One of his agents is caught, Timothy Webster, who is in Richmond posing as a Southerner and, delivering military intelligence to the North. He gets caught and is hanged in Richmond for being a spy. So Pinkerton really, and his agents were really ready to put their lives on the line to do this work. Now Pinkerton became very closely associated with McClellan, and of course McClellan has a very dubious reputation.
Checkered.
Checkered is a good way to put it, in terms of his role in the Union Army, and he just famously just waited and allowed the South, to amass their armies and didn't strike when he might have. And there's a theory out there that one reason why he didn't strike when he had a clear advantage earlier in the war that could have been, quite decisive. And again, I do say up front that I'm not an expert on this military dimension and McClellan's armies and whatnot. And there are many wonderful books written about it. But there are those who think that Pinkerton, in his surveillance and in his military sort of espionage activities, overestimated the military power of the Southern armies, particularly the armies that were gathered, really just across the river from Washington D.C., which was this, of course, incredibly important line when they were, where the capital city was potentially under attack. And so McClellan, didn't attack sooner because he had these inflated ideas about how big the Southern armies were, and that some historians point to Pinkerton and say Pinkerton was giving him these inflated numbers. Now, other historians have disputed that, and there's a sort of pro-Pinkerton camp and anti-Pinkerton camp among military historians. And I won't wade into that because it gets into a lot of detail. Certainly, if nothing else, Pinkerton's association with McClellan, and they were very tight, and he really served with McClellan for a long time during the war, did not help Pinkerton's wartime reputation. But in a way, at least to give him the benefit of the doubt, McClellan was the top general. He was placed in a position by Lincoln to be kind of McClellan's right-hand person and to gather intelligence for McClellan. So you can't really fault Pinkerton for taking the job. It was really an incredibly important job, and he was trying to do his duty for the Union Army. Now, whether he got some of those intelligence reports wrong, I hesitate to say, and whether those intelligence reports were really why McClellan behaved the way he did or made the decisions he did, I also hesitate to say. It's very complicated. I think McClellan, there's a lot of faults with McClellan that you could point to in addition to whatever faulty intelligence he had. But it is sort of unfortunate that Pinkerton's reputation ended up being tarnished in this way. But perhaps he does bear some responsibility. I don't think anyone could fault his motivations or his intentions. Whereas I think with McClellan personally, you can get into his motivations and his intentions. He was such a vain man, and he had a lot of personal ambitions that I think transcended the war. So a lot of people could really fault McClellan in a lot of different ways. Pinkerton, I think maybe he got some things wrong, but it was a really tough job to go send your agents undercover into the Southern Army and try to figure out what they were doing. So I think his intentions were good, if nothing else.
Yeah, it didn't really help McClellan because he was primed to listen. But as Lincoln said, he had all the talents of a stationary engine. He was a great organizer, but trying to get him to move was, another story. This guy was talking in the back of his ear. So,
Yeah. It's very interesting. I'd actually like to learn some more about that whole question, and would encourage others to as well. It's pretty fascinating.
I'd like to ask a question that you alluded to before, or that concerned an issue that you alluded to before, Josh. When you're talking about when Lincoln was starting his journey, the inaugural train ride, he never thought that, he knew there was anger in the country, but he never thought he would be at risk. But then there was one moment in Pennsylvania, either in Philadelphia or Harrisburg, when he made that statement, which I had always known, in which he said that he would prefer to be assassinated rather than surrender the values and ideals of the country. I always knew he had made that statement. I never knew until reading your book that he made that statement right after learning of this serious assassination plot. And that almost changed the whole focus of the way he was thinking, that now he realizes this is serious. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's one of our favorite moments in the book. So, I described this night when Abraham Lincoln gets to Philadelphia with his entourage, and after his 14-hour day, when you read his itinerary on this inaugural journey, I said how busy it was. I would get personally exhausted just reading about it, because you can just imagine going through these days where it's so intense, and the exhaustion, you can just feel it. And so at the end of this incredibly long day, he's in Philadelphia. He's just given all these speeches. He's, in this packed hotel. There've been receptions. He had to shake 1,000 hands. His voice is hoarse. He's exhausted. After midnight, he's pulled into this hotel room for a meeting and told that there's this assassination plot against him. And, Mr. President-elect, we're going to have to change your itinerary, and we're going to have to somehow ferry you through Baltimore in the middle of the night and put you on a different train, and you're going to wear a disguise. And it's just crazy. And he has to somehow digest all this. And the first suggestion that his handlers have, and that Pinkerton has, is let's put you on a train tonight and just get the hell out of Philadelphia and get you to Washington, D.C. now, a couple days before you're supposed to get there. And so you would pass through Baltimore a couple days before you were supposed to pass through Baltimore, and no one would know that you're passing through. And so you'll be safe, and then you'll get to Washington, D.C., and you can protect yourself. And all of these kind of would-be assassins, wouldn't even know where you are. But in order to do that, he hears that plan and says, no, I will not do that. I absolutely am not going to leave Philadelphia tonight because I have an event in about 6 hours, the next morning, that I absolutely cannot miss here in Philadelphia. I'm not going to miss it. Figure out another plan. I'll do something else to avoid this plot, but I am not going to leave Philadelphia before tomorrow morning. And it's because he was set to attend this ceremony for George Washington's birthday at Independence Hall, the site of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And Abraham Lincoln, as the president-elect, was to go there for this big ceremony and raise a flag to commemorate George Washington, and to raise a flag for the brand new state of Kansas that had just been let into the Union as a free state as opposed to a slave state. And there had been enormous conflict about the new, this new territory to become a state of Kansas, and whether it would be a free state or a slave state. And so it was an incredibly loaded symbolic moment taking place at the very site of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas and Jefferson wrote, that all men are created equal. And, to celebrate the birthday of the first president, and to inaugurate, and to welcome Kansas into the nation as a free state. It just could not be more loaded. And he's going to go there, and he could not miss this event and send the message that he was too scared to show up to give a speech at Independence Hall. to commemorate George Washington. It would just be sort of, in his mind, unthinkable to miss this event. So he goes ahead to this event, but he had just learned, a few hours earlier, after getting probably 3 or 4 hours sleep, he has to go at dawn, and give this speech and raise this flag with the sun rising on Independence Hall, to talk about what it means to celebrate George Washington, the first president, and what it means to raise this flag with this, new free state. He was probably feeling pretty loopy at the time, and he had just learned that, people were going to kill him, and he had to, somehow escape this horrible assassination plot. And he has to give this talk. And as he often does, he gives speeches extemporaneously. Sometimes he'll write some prepared remarks, but sometimes he'll just talk. And some of, in my opinion, his best speeches are ones where he's just sort of talking off the cuff. And he gives, this wonderful speech. And he actually, as Daniel said, in the speech, he says, as I stand here, and I don't have the words in front of me, but I would rather be assassinated than forsake these important principles of liberty and equality that were signed here at this very place where I'm standing at Independence Hall. And no one who's listening to the speech, no one who's there has any idea that he's referring to an actual assassination plot. He's actually thinking in his mind, I would rather stand here and give this speech and risk assassination, rather than not talk about these important principles, and that some things are more important than my own life or death. I'm the president now, and I stand for something greater than my own life. So it's a powerful speech. It's a powerful moment, made more so when you learn that he just learned that he was, again, only hours earlier, that he was actually in danger of being assassinated.
Very interesting. One of our listeners has an interesting question that I thought about as well when I was reading this book. I want to fast forward 102 years from the events. Have you thought about writing about the John F. Kennedy assassination? And one reason that that thought occurred to me as well, specifically when you mentioned that the crowds along the Lincoln's route knew of his itinerary. And I know if with the JFK assassination, there was always controversy about the itinerary of Dallas being in the newspapers before the president got there. So have you had any thoughts about doing a book on the JFK assassination?
Well, that's a great question. Not in the works right now, but my co-author Brad, it's a subject he's covered in the past. It's a subject I've covered in the past. In fact, my background is in documentary television, and Brad Meltzer and I did a TV story about the Kennedy assassination once that was quite fascinating. And so we're both certainly interested in the subject matter. We're not addressing it at the moment,
Okay.
But, it could come in the future. So,
okay, great.
I actually also just learned a sort of interesting fact about that assassination, which is that, and I could get some of my exact facts wrong here, but it was the Kennedy assassination that led to the creation of actual federal statutes making this attempted or the assassination or attempted assassination of a president a federal crime as opposed to a state murder charge. Until Kennedy, and I did some research on this because of our book, and one of the questions we thought about was why weren't there charges against these conspirators, these Baltimore conspirators who we describe in detail in the book, and I didn't talk quite as much about in this conversation. And one potential reason for that is that it wasn't a federal crime, so it would have just been up to the kind of state officials, law enforcement officials in Maryland to try it as a sort of a conspiracy to murder or just attempted murder, and that's a difficult charge to prove. So that's a sort of an interesting little side fact about the Kennedy assassination.
Okay, back to the 19th century. Tragically, of course, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of John Wilkes Booth and his relationship to Maryland and Baltimore?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it also gives me an excuse to bring in this organization that I alluded to before, the Knights of the Golden Circle, who the Baltimore conspirators who we write about in the book, we go into some detail in the book. The ringleader is this sort of colorful character who's a barber, Cipriano Ferrandini. But he and some other members of this group that was planning to assassinate Lincoln on the way to Washington, D.C. Before his inauguration were members of this secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle. That was a pro-slavery, kind of pro-Southern rights secret society. They were armed. They were, essentially a militia. And they had this grandiose vision that they could expand the South into Mexico and Central America and Cuba to basically expand slavery in that direction, to create sort of a Southern slave empire based in the Southern United States that would then be much bigger than the Northern United States. So slavery would not be threatened by the North anymore. So they were, these sort of pro-slavery zealots. And John Wilkes Booth, who was a Baltimorean, was a member of this organization. So he was not directly, as far as we know, involved in the planning of this Baltimore plot, but it's almost unquestionable that he knew some of these characters who were involved in this 1861 earlier plot to assassinate Lincoln. He belonged to the same chapter of the Knights of the Golden Circle that the ringleaders of the Baltimore plot belonged to. So he was probably in many of the same meetings with these characters. And even more importantly, he was of the same ilk. He was involved in the same Baltimore societies. He was a prominent person in Baltimore. Of course, he was a famous actor, as we all know. So he was sort of a key member of Baltimore society. So he knew these people. He shared the same sentiments. He was, a secessionist. John Wilkes Booth really belongs in the same category as the assassination, as the would-be assassins that we talk about in this book. If he wasn't involved in the planning, he probably knew about it. He probably knew these characters. He probably would have supported it. And then he was also involved in this organization called the National Volunteers that we talk about. That was another kind of militant pro-slavery organization. And he was in those circles, and he stayed in those circles throughout the war. He was influenced by these people. He was inspired by the rhetoric of the Knights of the Golden Circle. He was still a member when he himself, became involved in the later plot and became Lincoln's assassin. The language of the Knights of the Golden Circle was very much his language. The ideology he shared. So we really, we don't write a lot about John Wilkes Booth in our book, partly because we didn't want people to get confused. Because anytime you hear like Lincoln assassination, everyone always thinks about John Wilkes Booth. Right. We of course wanted to write about this earlier plot, and distinguish it from the later actual assassination in 1865. But John Wilkes Booth really was of the same milieu and the same. He would have fit right in there, and probably did fit right in there with some of the characters that we write about. He was part of the same Baltimore society.
Got it. Martin, do you have a comment?
Yeah, hi. When you published your book and we first read it, it sort of sent a shudder through my family because of a mention of one of the conspirators. As you were mentioning before, Lincoln was always, became really the butt of a lot of jokes. A lot of vitriol was sent his way. Caricatures, the original gorilla was one of his names, a buffoon. They always made fun of how tall and skinny he was and stuff. And one person asked, how did he feel about all this attention? And he goes, well, and he always was telling stories. And he goes, well, this reminds me of the story of the fellow who had said something bad and was being tarred and feathered and carried out of town on a rail. And somebody he shouted at the guy and said, how do you feel now about it? And he goes, well, if it wasn't for the honor of the thing, I would rather walk. So anyway, going back to the conspirators, of one of the conspirators, does the last name Luckett ring a bell? James Luckett?
Right. Now, I want to make sure.
Pinkerton met.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
In the bar.
Exactly. Yeah. Luckett is a key, is sort of a key piece of the puzzle, because when Pinkerton goes undercover in Baltimore, he creates a sort of a fake office for his, his stockbroking firm. He's pretending to be this Southern stockbroker, and he befriends other people who are in the same building, including another stockbroker who's kind of down the hall in another office. And Pinkerton's trying to kind of insinuate himself among all these kind of these Southern characters, and and sort of spot the people who could, who might be extremists in some fashion. And he gets to know this actual Southern stockbroker named James Luckett. And James Luckett ends up being one of the key people who kind of keys Pinkerton in that this plot is being planned. And Luckett actually reveals that he is one of the financiers of this organization that's plotting this assassination. And and Pinkerton then offers to contribute to the cause, and says, I believe in slavery too. I'll contribute $10,000, which is was Pinkerton's way of kind of getting in good with these people. Like, if you're really ready to put up some money, that shows that you're a true believer. And so Pinkerton gives Luckett some money to kind of contribute to the cause. And Luckett is really one of the key people who lets him know that this plot's going on, and gives him some key evidence.
Well, unfortunately,
any relation?
Yeah, that's what I was going to get around to. My family goes back to colonial days, and he's actually, we were in through Port Tobacco, and he is a relative.
Oh, wow.
And it's sort of a dubious
honor.
I wouldn't want to know if our family's name would have been Mudd, just like the doctor who treated, John Wilkes Booth afterwards. But it did sort of send a shudder through the family, because I have a cousin named James, and we have our family tree. We've got that.
Wow.
It's difficult to find.
I mean, similar stories everywhere. And probably anyone with roots, in Maryland, would find, if not James Luckett, someone similar. That was the society at the time. Now, there's sort of an interesting anecdote about James Luckett that comes up later on. I don't know much about, his life story or anything, but Pinkerton, there's a point, after all of this happens and after the war, there's this sort of renewed interest. This whole plot was sort of forgotten during the war because there's a war going on. It's more important than this assassination plot that didn't even happen. So people sort of forget about it for a while, and everyone wanted to keep it top secret anyway. But there's a renewed interest in it after the war, and Pinkerton, starts revealing some information about it, and people start digging around. Journalists are digging around. People want to write books about it. There's an effort to compile information about it. But interestingly, one of the stipulations that Pinkerton has in order to share his files, his intelligence files on the case, is that no one reveal James Luckett's name, because, as much as he, despised James Luckett's politics, he had gotten to know the guy, and he just didn't want to reveal Luckett's name as part of this conspiracy, because he thought that, bad things could happen to him. So it's sort of an interesting detail that, for whatever reasons, Pinkerton was like, yeah, I will share my notes and show you how we learned about this plot. He had no problem sharing the name of Cipriano Ferrandini and Otis Hillard, two of the key conspirators who they got to know. But he just said, keep Luckett's name out of this. I don't want the guy to get, to anything bad to happen to him. So,
he was trying to keep him as a resource later, because I'm sure that, there were plots on, there was a lot. I mean, obviously there was a lot of bad blood after the war. So maybe he wanted it to make him look, even more of an accomplished detective by not giving away, even after World War II, we didn't let everybody know that we read the codes for Germany, till years later, because we wanted to keep it as an asset, but that is interesting though.
Yeah,
it is. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. I think we've covered all of our questions. I think we're good. This has been a fascinating talk. I just want to say a few things now. We have copies of the Lincoln Conspiracy signed by Josh available. If you would like one, please email friendsofthefieldlibrary@gmail.com. Again, that's friendsofthefieldlibrary@gmail.com. And I think we're going to, I think that's going to about do it. I just want to say thank you to everybody who attended tonight's event. I want to thank in particular Alan Most of the Friends, Jack Eckhart and Jennifer Brown in the Field Library for helping out. And everyone who came out tonight. Most of all, of course, I want to thank our guest, Josh. This is fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank everyone too for coming out. Really appreciate it. And anyone who's read the book or shown interest in it, we truly appreciate it. And thank you for joining this talk.
Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers as well.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a great talk. I learned a lot. It was really, really interesting. And we hope to see all of you back sometime. So thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate it. On behalf of the Friends, thank you.
I put the email address in the chat.
Okay, so the email address to order a book is in the chat.
Yes.
friendsofthefieldlibrary@gmail.com.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This has been a great night.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you, Josh.
Right.
Yeah.